Welcome to American History Gazette. I'm Jake Suggs, and today we are joined by Allan Andrade. Allan is a World War II historian and the author of Leopoldville, a tragedy too long kept secret. Allan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the sinking of the Leopoldville was a huge event, and a lot of people haven't heard of it, which is surprising because it was such a disaster. And it's quite evident reading your book that you did a lot of research writing this book. It's quite evident you were very in-depth. It seems that you told the story from like every point of view of the soldiers who were on the ship. So I'm curious as to what inspired you to write this book and how the research and writing process was.
Actually, my original project was something else entirely. I lived in New York at the time, New York City, and I wanted to write about the contribution of Community Silver Plate, which is up in Oneida, New York, Sherrill, New York, actually, which is next to Oneida, New York. And during the World War II period, like so many other companies, they ceased civilian production and they manufactured products for the war effort. They did things like swords and flatware for the army and so forth. So I was doing that, and the company was very supportive. They gave me a lot of information, which included the fact that they had 32 former employees who were killed in the various branches of the armed forces. And as part of what I was doing, I decided to research how each one was killed. One of them was a 20-year-old orphan by the name of Sergeant Benjamin Joseph Blaskowski. He worked in the maintenance department at Oneida Limited. And all it said was that he was killed, they actually said on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944, somewhere in the European theater in a troop ship sinking. And that was all I started with. It's a long story, but eventually I figured out that he was killed on the Leopoldville. And that's what eventually led me to the Leopoldville. I said to myself, what I was doing about Oneida Limited was very interesting to me, but it was a localized New York story, whereas the Leopoldville was a national disaster. So I shifted gears, so to speak, and concentrated on the Leopoldville and put the other story on the back burner, which I never did get around to completing. And I dedicated my book to Benjamin Joseph Blaskowski, since he was the one that led me to the Leopoldville.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, it was an international disaster. There were many nationalities who were on board, but you have, personal letters from these soldiers who were writing to their families while they were aboard the ship and in England getting ready to head to France. So, I mean, you were interviewing family members. What was that process like?
Very, very emotional. I've developed a lot of friendships with people over the years. Either they were survivors and their families, or they were guys that participated in the rescue, or they were the relatives of the fellows who were killed, such as widows. And I just an amazing outpouring from the people that gave me access to their personal letters and other documents and photographs that are in the book. I have about 75 photographs and illustrations in the book. And it's really all from these people that cooperated with me. One of the ways that I track down people, which you might find very interesting, being in the police department, when we were stumped, we used to turn to the news media. So what I did was, I realized that in the 1940s period, many, if not most people, were born, lived out their lives, and passed away in the same community in which they were born. So I had the National Archive documents, which of course included the casualty list. So I knew how many fellows were killed. I knew the states that they came from, and I knew the cities or towns that they came from. So I concentrated on fellows who were from small towns, figuring that they were more likely to have passed away at the time that they were still living in the same town. So what I would do is I would contact the local editor of a local newspaper and say, look, I have a story for you that was never covered, the Leopoldville, and I can give it to you from the angle of a local fellow who was either survived or killed in the incident. And the editor would do this, and his reporters very frequently would track down his widow still living in the area, or a brother or sister or cousin or somebody still living in the area, and they would then be put in touch with me, and they would provide me with letters, with documents, with all kinds of information. He was engaged, he was married, he had 2 kids, his wife was pregnant, all that kind of personal information. Of course, what I was trying to do was to put faces on statistics. When you say 763 killed in this incident and 493 bodies never found, that's a meaningless number. But when you're looking at his picture in the book and you're reading his last letter home to his wife, how much he loves her and he's waiting for his son to be born and things like that, it puts a face on it. And that's what I tried to do.
Yeah, that's incredible, and it makes it a much more personal and emotional process, I bet. But the Leopoldville, it was a troop ship, used to transport troops across oceans, and it was actually a pretty old ship.
Well, actually, the Leopoldville that they were on was built in 1929 in Hoboken, Belgium. And it was originally an ocean liner which went from Anvers, Belgium, to the Congo. And it originally had 2 stacks. And then in 1937, they completely renovated it. They made it into 1 stack. They lengthened it. They did a whole bunch of changes. So at the time that it was torpedoed in 1944, Christmas Eve of 1944, it looked entirely different from what it did in 1929 when it was built. So you had a Belgian crew carrying American soldiers under British escort going to France. What could go wrong?
I'd like to backtrack a little bit. Something remarkable that I learned in your book about the men who were on the Leopoldville when they were being transported to England from the States. There were men from all but 2 states.
All of them that were killed from the 48 states except for 2 states, Delaware and Wyoming. There were guys from all over the country on the ship, including Delaware. But of the casualty list, there were fellas killed from 46 of the then 48 states, and 1 from Canada. And I wasn't able quite to figure out whether he was a volunteer or a naturalized American citizen. I have a feeling that he was that he was still a Canadian, but a volunteer. And I found out later on that some people say 762 were killed because they don't count this fellow from Canada. And they were all from the 66th Infantry Division, so I wasn't going to nitpick. As far as I'm concerned, whether he was from Canada or from the U.S., he's one of the dead. So I listed as 763, not 762.
Yeah, I don't see why anyone wouldn't. I mean, he's still a casualty of the disaster, but how prominent of a force were German U-boats and submarines at this point of the war? Because the troop ship was sunk by a German submarine hit by a torpedo. So how prominent of a force were the German U-boats and submarines?
Well, they certainly weren't a force as they were in what they called the glory days of 1942, when they were sinking ships right off of North Carolina. But the thing that bothers me is that the day before Christmas Eve, December 23rd, this submarine rather, U-boat, actually sunk a coastal vessel right off of Cherbourg. So the powers to be had to know that there was a submarine or submarines operating in the vicinity, and yet they sent these fellows into harm's way, knowing that a ship had been sunk just the day before. So that always bothered me, but I'm probably not pronouncing it right. I believe it was called the Skimmish. It was a small coastal vessel. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but I think it was called Skimmish. I have it in my research files, but it was sunk the day before. Another thing that bothers me is that people were telling me on their tombstones of their loved ones, they always had December 25th, because officially everybody was considered deceased on December 25th. The torpedoing was actually just before 6 o'clock on December 24th. And those that went into the water was 48 degrees. The ship sank at approximately 8:30. So there's no way that any of these fellows survived into the 25th, past midnight. They all must have died either by drowning or from hypothermia by the time the 25th came along. And the only thing I can think of is that because so many were missing, the Army probably did not consider you officially deceased until 24 hours later. So families were getting telegrams that their loved one was killed on the 25th, when in reality it's on the 24th. And I have numerous photographs that people have sent me of a tombstone of their loved one, and it says on it December 25th instead of December 24th. And I think that's just another insult from the government.
Yeah, that's not right at all, I don't think. I mean, that's just a logistical thing, I feel like. And that theme of miscommunication and lack of communication is a huge part of this tragedy and why it was amplified to a bigger disaster than it needed to be. But these men are being transported from the States to England, and they get in England and they're kind of waiting orders. What's the morale of the guys there? I mean, it's Christmas time. They're about to go to France and go to war. What's the morale like among these guys?
Well, actually, they expected that they were going to spend Christmas in England, and they were sending letters back to their families. Everybody thought that they were going to be staying in England. And then because of the Battle of the Bulge, as part of the Allied response, they suddenly got orders to prepare to ship out. So everything was done very quickly. One of the fellows who survived, that's in my book, he was saying that he was a cook, and he was preparing the turkeys and everything else for Christmas dinner, and then everything was just left behind and stop what you're doing and get ready to leave. So it was a very rushed, haphazard move. It wasn't something that they expected. This was quite unexpected.
Wow, I can't imagine what that would feel like if you're celebrating Christmas with your buddies and all of a sudden you're called to war. But there was, when they were boarding the ship to go to the channel and travel to France, there was a huge delay boarding the ships, and there was a lot of miscommunication there. So what was going on at the docks, and why was there such a delay in boarding the ships?
No. It's just that it was very haphazard way in which they boarded. One captain refused to go on to where he was supposed to go until his guys got coffee and donuts. I think that's in my book. And so it was just done in a very haphazard manner. They pulled out a little after 9 o'clock on December 24th. They were notified on the 23rd, and by the time they got prepared and took the train and marched to Southampton Dock, they were leaving on the 24th. But everything was all up in the air. A lot of mistakes. I later found out in my documents from the National Archives, the Cheshire, which was also in the convoy, had another 2,000 soldiers on it. They didn't even have a passenger list. I mean, that's how badly the thing was handled. And the passenger list of the Leopoldville had numerous errors. So it was really done very poorly.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was talking about. Is I watched a documentary with you in it, I believe by Spark, where they were diving to the site, and they were mentioning that the the list of the troops who were supposed to be on the ships was all discombobulated, and they were all mixed up.
Right. I think you're referring to Deep Wreck Mysteries, Sunk on Christmas Eve. That was on the National Geographic. I was hired as the historical consultant for that, and they flew me over to England and France, and I was actually on a research vessel directly over the wreck when the divers dove the wreck to film it for the documentary. It's quite an experience. And I had with me, I asked them, documentaries don't have a large budget. So I had asked them, do you have enough money in your budget to bring along some of the families? And they said yes. So we actually had a survivor, and we had two families one where the body was never found and one where the body was found. So we were all on the ship, directly over the wreck, and the survivor was given a wreath. He said a few appropriate words, and we tossed the wreath on the water in memory of those who were killed.
Wow, that's incredible. What was that like?
It was very emotional.
That must have been quite the experience, yeah. But it's wintertime across the English Channel. You mentioned that the water's 48 degrees. I assume the water's very rough. What are the conditions of the English Channel as they're crossing to France?
The waters were rough at the time that they were hit, and the Belgian crew didn't speak English, so there was a language barrier that entered into some of the issues. The food they were given, the fellows that I interviewed referred to as green slop. A lot of guys got seasick and were, throwing up and things like that. So it was not a good time.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a pleasant or enjoyable experience. But they get across the English Channel. They're 5.5 miles from where they're supposed to be, which is the port of Cherbourg, which you mentioned earlier. And they're suddenly hit by a German torpedo from a German submarine. So can you just walk me through that moment when the guys are just on board and all of a sudden, bam, they get hit with the torpedo? What's that like?
Well, absolutely horrible. The fellas, some of them were on deck, some of them were below deck. The ship had wooden stairs. The torpedo blew out the wooden stairs of some of the decks so that the fellows below those stairs were trapped. They couldn't get out, and they were quickly drowned, and they, of course, probably went down with the ship and are down at the bottom. It's in about 180 feet of water that the ship is resting. Some of them were playing cards. Some of them were... One fellow was a very religious guy. I know his fiancée said that she knows he was reading the Bible at the time that the torpedo hit, things like that. So everybody was doing something different, but it had to be very tough. Other guys, because they were up on deck, they didn't realize it right away how bad the damage was. They didn't realize that the ship was sinking. Just part of the various miscues that made the thing so much worse.
Yeah, I can assume it would just be absolute chaos on deck and under deck, everyone just scrambling. I know everyone was trying to grab their life jackets and some didn't have life jackets. So you can imagine and picture just absolute chaos on board the Leopoldville. But there was a huge problem with the transmissions that affected the rescue operation. They contacted their high command and they said, "We've been hit." And it was like 40 minutes until Cherbourg got the message, which was the port that they were only 5 miles from, that they'd been hit and the rescue operation commenced. So how did the slow transmissions affect the rescue operations?
The issue was that the transmission, the frequency that they were using in Cherbourg was different from the frequency back in England. So when they sent the message to England that they'd been torpedoed, that had to work its way up to the right person, who then notified Cherbourg. Now, they did signal Cherbourg, and with the fellows at the port with binoculars, they could see a ship in the distance. But the message they sent was, "Need assistance." And with the binoculars, they could see that the ship had stopped. So apparently they incorrectly assumed that the engines had broken down, and that's how they interpreted it. They didn't realize that they had been torpedoed. They just heard, "Need assistance." Ship is stopped. Oh, the engine must have broke down. So, and then the Brilliant, which was in the convoy, there were other, we call them destroyers, they call them corvettes, because it was under British escort. They had to go out and hunt for the submarine. The Brilliant made the decision that he was going to pull alongside and take on survivors. So he had to line up his ship, and then he pulled alongside. And if you can imagine, in rough seas, the ships are going up and down, back and forth. And once people are told to start jumping to the Brilliant, the British sailors are yelling, "Yank, your ship is sinking, jump," So once you line up, you have to decide, do I have the guts to try and jump? Because it might be a 15-foot separation at times with that going up and back and forth, and then the ships are banging together. You can imagine the horrible noise of the two ships banging together. And then some of the fellows who jumped misgauged their jump, and they fell between the ships and were crushed as the ship came together. So to get guys to jump, after you see blood on the side of the ships from guys that have been crushed, guys might say, "I'm not jumping. I'm staying right here." So it had to be total chaos. And then the Belgian crew spoke Flemish, and the captain eventually gave the order to abandon ship, but he gave it in Flemish, and apparently only for the crew. So the crew is leaving, and the soldiers are standing around not knowing what to do. And the lifeboats, they didn't know how to lower the lifeboats, the crew. And another thing I didn't mention yet is that they were never given proper instruction on the use of the life preserver. So later on, they found bodies in the water with either broken necks or that had died from choking because the life preserver was not put on properly. And you mentioned about the delay in the shore. Once you do get the message to shore, first of all, because it was Christmas Eve, a lot of the fellows who were on the boats had been given the night off. So they were either in the bar or they went to church, whatever they did. So you had to go out and round these guys up and get them back to their ship. And then once you get to the ship, as you know, it's not like a car where you turn the key and you take off. You got to charge up the engines. You got to make sure you have a sufficient crew on board before you can pull out. So all these delays are going on, and while these delays are going on, guys are dying.
It's hard to find the words to paint the picture of what that scene would have looked like for those guys standing at the rail of the Leopoldville and the guys falling in between the ships. I mean, when I read that in your book, it sent a chill down my spine just thinking of that scene and how horrific that would have been.
One of the survivors told me he heard them calling out to their mothers as they went under the water.
You just can't imagine these guys had back in the World War II had to go through stuff like this. It's just...
And the other thing you want to remember, many, if not most, because from the casualty list I could figure out, many, if not most, were only 18, 19, 20 years old. So we're talking about kids that maybe 6 months before were graduating from high school. And now they're fighting for their life in the English Channel.
The heroics and the bravery of these guys is just not to be understated, but there was a big thing about a big debate afterwards about the captain dropped the anchor of the Leopoldville. He dropped the anchor because he wanted to stabilize the ship, and that would have prevented it from being towed in, because there was a debate on we can tow the Leopoldville in its crippled state and maybe save these guys, or we can drop the anchor and kind of stabilize the ship.
Well, it was Commander Pringle of the Brilliant who told him to drop anchor. And you got to understand, there was a minefield to protect the ships coming in. You had to stay within, so you wouldn't go into the minefield. So after the ship was torpedoed and it lost power, they were concerned that the ship could drift into the minefield. So that was the reason for telling him to drop anchor. Whether that was the right decision or the wrong decision, I was a lieutenant in the police department, and I know any kind of decision that you have to make as a superior officer, it's very easy to be a Monday morning quarterback and say you should have done this, you should have done that. But you're talking about an extremely stressful situation where you're making decisions, split-second decisions. And like I say, it's very easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. Why didn't you do it this way?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right.
So I really can't fault Pringle. Pringle later on got what they call a measure of your Majesty's displeasure, which I guess is the equivalent of our court-martial for his actions. And I really can't find any fault with Pringle, because whatever he did, because of Pringle, there were at least 500 that did jump to his ship and were saved. So because of Commander Pringle, the fatalities were reduced by at least 500. So I really can't fault the man.
I think you're absolutely right. It's easy to look in hindsight at decisions like that and say, oh, well, you should have done this, you should have done that. But when you're in the stress of a split-second decision, especially in war, when you have thousands of men's lives counting on you, it's very difficult to make decisions under those circumstances. So he ended up saving, 500 lives. So I agree, you can't fault the man, especially making a decision like that. But the smaller ships from the port finally make their way out. What's the scene in the channel? There's hundreds of soldiers who have abandoned ship, jumped in the water, floating in the water. The water's freezing, and now there's a bunch of smaller vessels, with flashlights traveling through the channel looking for survivors. What's that rescue operation look like?
Now you're talking. It's nighttime, so the only lights that are from these rescue ships that are putting lights on the water, and the fellas who are freezing, a lot of them didn't have the strength to be pulled up. So I have some of the deck logs that I got from the National Archives of some of these boats, and you had guys that jumped into the water themselves to help a soldier get up on, be pulled out of the water. So they put their own lives at risk. There was one fellow who actually was in the hospital with some kind of an infection in his leg, and that's why he was or his foot, and that's why he was in the hospital. And once he heard about it, he got up out of his sick bed, left the hospital, made his way back to his ship, and he went out there, even though he had this condition with his foot. And he was one of the ones that later on was reported to have jumped into the water to help a soldier in the water that couldn't help himself. I mean, that's a hero in my book.
Yeah, absolutely, that's a hero. So how many guys were in the water after the ship sank, and how many guys were able to be saved from that smaller vessel rescue operation?
Well, between the whole thing, there must have been about 1,200, I would say. Well, let's see, there were over 2,200 on the boat. So if there's 706, almost 800 killed, that means you had about almost 1,500 that made it. Now, however, out of that 1,500, 650 wound up in the hospital, either with injuries or with hypothermia. So even if you got picked up out of the water, there was a good chance you were going to spend some time in the hospital from hypothermia or from broken bones or whatever from jumping.
Yeah, I can imagine there were only a very few select guys who came out of this unscathed, especially having to deal with those icy channel waters. I bet a lot of guys were dealing with hypothermia and all kinds of issues. But after it's all said and done, Christmas morning, what does the channel look like? And the ship sank. There's probably guys floating out in the channel. How is that? What does that look like?
I was told by some of the survivors that bodies were floating up on the shore for weeks afterwards. So I can imagine that a certain amount of bodies were washing up on the shore, So it had to be really tough. And like I say, 650 were in the hospital. And remember something: not only did we lose lives, you lost your equipment. So they thought they were going to the bulge, and that's. Some people say they were going to the bulge. Some people say they were never supposed to go to the bulge. They were going to relieve another unit that was going to go to the bulge. But once they lost so much of their equipment, they certainly weren't going to the bulge. They eventually got the assignment of containing a pocket of 50,000 Germans around the submarine pens of Lorient and Saint Nazaire. That was the assignment they had till the end of the war. And so first they had to be resupplied with rifles and trucks and all of the supplies that went down with the Leopoldville. They had to be resupplied. So for a while after the ship sinking, they weren't doing anything except trying to recover and regroup.
A nightmare in terms of the casualties, but a nightmare also logistically, I'm sure. My follow-up question was going to be, these guys in Europe who are already fighting at the bulge and these places, they're expecting, reinforcements, 2,200 guys, and all of a sudden they're not getting them. How does that impact the war already going on in Europe?
Well, it had to take some effect, I'm sure. I mean, it goes without saying. Didn't make it any easier, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the guys at the Bulge, that's some of the most brutal fighting of the war, and all you can really hope for is reinforcements. And I'm sure when they heard that they weren't getting any, it was probably pretty devastating. But there was a hearing afterwards to investigate what had happened and the actions of the captains. You mentioned that Pringle was court-martialed. What was the hearing all about? Can you walk me through how that went and what the verdict was?
Well, there's always an investigation. I actually have my research files from the National Archives. I can read some of the things off to you. A fire drill and abandoned ship drill should be carried out on every ship carrying troops before she proceeds to sea. Excuse me. The Leopoldville had upwards of 6 hours before completing loading and before reaching the channel. So one of the things they criticized was the fact that they didn't have a proper abandoned ship drill. Each soldier on board be made to put on his life jacket to see that he thoroughly understands the method of wearing it and how it should be secured. Further, that he be instructed not to inflate the life jacket until he's in the water.
And that raised a lot of issues with the guys jumping and breaking their necks and choking, right?
The escort commanders be instructed to order the master to immediately make an inspection and report on damage before anchoring a ship in the open sea. Apparently, they said that Limbaugh, who was the Belgium captain, didn't have a thorough inspection of the damage right away. There was somewhat of a delay in that too. So that's what they're referring to there. Escort commanders be instructed, when no rescue vessels are immediately available, that one of their primary functions in the cross-channel shuttle service is that of rescue. Any signals to home commands which may involve the need of rescue craft. So they were concerned that was about the business of being on different radio frequencies. And then all small craft and harbor craft, usually considered available for rescue work, be fitted with scramble nets, that the decks of these craft be cleared of any non-useful obstructions so as to make available greater deck space, and that a ready pool of seamen be formed in order to quickly augment the crew as found necessary. Those were the conclusions that they came up with.
So there's a lot of conflicting, things that happen there with the recommendations and the procedures and how they weren't necessarily carried out, or they weren't necessarily prepared of how they should have been based on those recommendations. Like you said, the inflating of the life jackets, they have to inspect the damage, the procedures, and the fire alarms. There's a lot that didn't happen, which probably cost more casualties than necessary. But when I watched the documentary, there was talk of a cover-up by the government because there was a lot of, I guess you could say, malpractice and a lot of mistakes made by people and miscommunication that cost lives. So the government had it in their best interest to cover it up, to make it look like, these mistakes weren't as bad. Like you mentioned, when you were first investigating this, all it said was, they were killed in the European theater of war. It didn't mention that they died on a troop ship hit by a torpedo and all this chaos ensued. So in your professional opinion, what would you say about there being, is it a cover-up, or is this just a forgotten tragedy of World War II?
I think it's a little bit of both. I read an excellent book in all about 1944, the major events of 44. I forget the name of the book now, At Last Twilight, something like that. And it's an excellent book that I would recommend. However, in this 600 or 700 pages of this book, there isn't one page, one paragraph, one sentence that mentions the Leopoldville. So whoever wrote that book did tremendous research, but apparently had no knowledge of the Leopoldville. And how can this happen? I mean, it's because The survivors told me when they were ready to go home at the end of the war, they were told, don't talk about this. And you're talking about a generation of young people that when you said don't talk about it, they didn't. A lot of these guys only started talking about it 50 years later. I was interviewing one fellow in New Jersey, and his wife's mouth just about dropped open, and she said to me, I'm married to this man for 50 years, and this is the first time I'm hearing about this. Other people told me every Christmas Eve their father would go up to the room, lock the door, and they would hear him crying inside, or others would say that he would get drunk, or he would get angry, and they would go like, what's the matter with you? It's Christmas Eve. And that's all they knew until little by little things finally started coming out about the Leopoldville. I had families tell me that they didn't know that their loved one was killed in the Leopoldville until they read my book and saw his name in the in memoriam section, because all they got was a telegram saying that your loved one was killed in the European theater. Period. And you didn't have, this is before television, it's before the internet. So people back then, they cried and you went on with your life.
Man, that is just truly awful. I can't even imagine the family members, because if you're in the States and you have, a brother, a husband, a cousin who's over there fighting in the war, and you get a telegram that they died in battle or in the war, you want to know why. And those questions hanging over their heads for years and decades is just...
Some people did get letters stating that it was Leopoldville, but the way they worded it, because I've seen the letters, many were saved. Unfortunately, your loved one was in the smaller group. That's the way they phrased it. Many were saved. Your loved one was in the smaller group. They didn't say that smaller group was 763 and that 493 bodies were never found.
Towards the end of your book, you say that all of the victims from the Leopoldville are buried at the American Cemetery in Normandy, except for one man. And there is one man from the Leopoldville who's buried at Epinal Cemetery. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But why is that? Why is there only one man out of, the 763 men, all of whom were buried at Normandy? Why was this one man separate from that?
At the time that my book was published, I didn't know. But since my book has been published, I'm still getting emails from people that want to give me additional information. And I heard from one of the interpreters from Epinal Cemetery, and I found out that the fellow Eugene Temple, who was from Indiana, had an older brother. Eugene Temple was 20, the Leopoldville victim. His brother Albert was 24, and he also was in the Army, and he was fighting in an area around Epinal, and he was killed. And he was buried in Epinal. So the family, at the request of the family, the two brothers were asked to be buried side by side. And so they gave me the plot, row, and grave numbers in Epinal Cemetery. That's why he's buried in Epinal Cemetery, so he could be buried next to his brother.
Wow. That is an amazing story, and it's amazing that you still have family members and people who are directly and indirectly involved or related to the tragedy still contacting you to this day. After you wrote the book and published it, what was the reception of all of the victims and the family members who were connected to the story? How did they receive it? Because I'm sure you got, like you said, a lot of emails and a lot of letters about it.
Families were very grateful. I've got some beautiful letters and emails from people thanking me. And then I also started getting a whole bunch of emails and letters and things from people asking for additional information. What can you tell me about my loved one? And I can help them a lot, because from the casualty list, I have, this is from the National Archives, from the official casualty list, I have his company, his regiment, even his platoon. And then I have how many survivors from his platoon, how many bodies were recovered, how many bodies were never found, and of the survivors from his platoon, whether they were hospitalized or not. So just from that information, I can pretty much say to someone, well, he went down with the ship, or he probably made it off the ship and drowned in the ocean. You know, so even that much information helps them. In some cases, I was able to put them in touch with a survivor who was able to give them additional information because they were in the same company as their loved one and knew them. So it's been quite an experience to help people out.
That's remarkable. That's such an amazing story, and that's amazing to hear. I'm sure those family members are very grateful. It seems to me that there probably isn't a single person on this planet who knows more about the Leopoldville than you. I would say, judging by the conversation we've just had and reading your book, that you are probably the leading expert on the Leopoldville disaster in the entire world. What would you say about that?
Well, I don't know in the entire world, but I certainly have been fortunate to learn a lot about it. And back in 2015, I was asked to lecture on my book at the Bush 41 Presidential Library and Museum. And in 2004, I was contacted by what was then called the White House Commission on Remembrance, and they asked me to help them plan out a ceremony honoring those who were killed on the Leopoldville. And the ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery at the Tomb of the Unknowns. And I recommended to them that they have the ceremony on November 15th of 2004. And the reason why I picked November 15th, number one, the weather would probably still be, you could luck out. And as it was, we had you couldn't have asked for a more beautiful day. It was mild, blue sky, it was a beautiful day. Couldn't very well have it on Christmas Eve. But the reason why November 15th, they sailed from New York Harbor on November 15th for England. So that was the tie-in. And they wanted a senator to escort one of the survivors up to the tomb with a floral wreath. And I recommended Byron Dorgan, who was the senator at the time from North Dakota. And the reason why I recommended Byron Dorgan was because his uncle, Allan Dorgan, was killed on the Leopoldville. So that was the tie-in. And there was a fellow by the name of Antonio Martinez who came all the way from California as a survivor to attend the ceremony. So I recommend that he be the one to escort the floral wreath with Dorgan. And then they also wanted one of the families who were killed to bring up the floral wreath. And I recommended a woman by the name of Lucy Ruggles, who was pregnant at the time with her husband's children that were going to be born. She had twin daughters in April of 1945. So she came from Virginia with her two daughters to attend the ceremony. And then after the ceremony, we were the guests of the Army for a luncheon. And it was just a beautiful day. Over 160 people attended the ceremony. They came from all over the United States.
Wow, that is incredible. I've been to Arlington Cemetery and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and it's already such a surreal and emotional place. I can't even imagine that additional level with all of those people who were involved. You had survivors and family members. It just must have been such a profound moment and such a profound day. I'm sure that's something that
it gave closure. I hate the word closure, but nevertheless, it gave a lot of closure to a lot of people, for want of a better word.
I think that's a great way to put it. I'm sure it gave a lot of closure and helped a lot of people be at ease with what happened. And, you answered a lot of their questions for them. So I'm sure they were eternally grateful. But Allan, I want to thank you so much for coming on and gracing us with your expertise on this tragic disaster that has been too long forgotten. I hope that everyone will be made aware of this, because it was such a tragic disaster that a lot of people don't know about, and it deserves to be known. So, Allan, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to link your book below. I urge everyone to go check it out on Amazon. It is absolutely phenomenal, filled with a bunch of firsthand accounts and letters and very personal things. So, Allan, thanks again for coming on.
If you could, it would be great if you could put up a review on Amazon, since you got it from Amazon. The other thing, the other thing, very, very quickly, it's like the story just doesn't end, because I recently was contacted by a publisher in France. They have translated my book into French, and very soon it's going to be made available in France in French.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I'll definitely leave you that Amazon review, and hopefully that helps you out. But Allan, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.